German Unification and Canadian Creation. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is January 29th, 2021. And on this date in history, 25 years ago today, was the destruction of the Challenger, one of the U.S. space shuttles that was used for multiple voyages, and it was kind of an opportunity that a lot of Americans saw as a way for civilians to also go to space and not just the best of the best of the best. And really, on that day, a lot of people's dreams died as schools across the nation were watching, and it blew up on television. So let's hope today goes a little bit better than that. Okay, so on the last episode of Notes, we talked about Italian unification. The Germans do it a lot different than the Italians. They use this weird thing called violence. So, Austria and Prussia had both fought over the hearts and souls of the German people for centuries before the establishment of Prussia as a kingdom and Austria as a kingdom. It's important to note that there's a difference between Prussia and Russia. Prussia was a German tribe, and the Russians, a massive country in Europe and in Asia. So Prussia formed something called the Zollverein, and the Zollverein was a customs union that gets rid of the 1800 tolls. So it basically makes it so that you can trade within the German Empire without having to pay some type of tariff as you go from each kingdom to each kingdom throughout all of Germany. Now, Metternich, the leader of Austria, the prime minister of Austria, he dominated all the German kingdom during most of his reign until he was actually chased out. Now, when the Prussian king William I, better known as Wilhelm I, took over, he enlarged the army. He creates a general staff, modernized weapons, and really pushed to increase the industrialization of the nation, which will set its foundation as a world power in the 20th century. And the middle class, that was very liberal, fought against all the changes that were created by William I. But William I will, actually he won't, but he'll put someone in place to unify Germany, and that is Otto von Bismarck. Okay, so Otto von Bismarck was a Junker. A Junker was part of the bourgeoisie, or wealthier class of people in Germany. And so, as the leader of the Reichstag, he's going to strengthen the army. He's going to start collecting taxes. And he uses a policy called realpolitik, or practical politics. So basically, the ends justifies the means. It doesn't matter how you get there. It just matters on getting to your destination. Again, it doesn't matter how you get there. It's just the destination that's the most important thing of realpolitik. Okay, and so he begins this unification process by going to war with Denmark. And he gets Austria to help him, and they go to war with Denmark, and they get Schleswig and Holstein. Okay, and they add those two provinces of southern Denmark or northern Germany, and this is part one of the unification. Again, he's testing who his allies are, who he can trust, and never get into a war with him, because you can never trust what he's going to do. I know he's dead, but time travel. Okay, so anyway, the AustriaPrussian War. So while they were fighting Denmark, Otto von Bismarck raised armies to go and attack Austria. And he had some deals behind the table to support Russia's attack on Poland and taking land away from Poland. So while they're doing that, he goes to war with Austria. Uh, France and Italy were promised land from this, and the fact that they had a railroad that connected major cities in Prussia and made it troop movement a lot easier, and superior weapons that Prussia had been creating for the last 50, 100 years made it much easier for them to defeat the Austrian army. Okay, so Prussia, once it defeats Austria and Denmark in battles, is going to unite the German states together, or annex them, kind of force them to be together, into a North German confederation. So they're just kind of loosely associated, but it's the beginning of the end of the existence of their monarchies. It's at this time that a lot of German kings with multiple sons would kick them out of the country just for their own protection. And this is whenever my great-great-great-grandfather would kick out his seventh-born son, and he would move to the United States during the Civil War and get drafted into the army as soon as he gets here. So the Reichstag was the parliament of Prussia, and it's put together by universal male suffrage. So Germany beats a lot of other countries to the punch. And the German Constitution is going to create a two-house legislature. Now, the lower house is elected by universal male suffrage, called the Reichstag, and the other one was part of the nobility. So this is kind of the House of Commons, House of Lords in England, and a little bit of a variance on the Senate and House of Representatives in the United States, where it's a little bit more prestigious to be in the Senate than it is to be in the House. The emperor was in charge of all of the army, the government, and all foreign policy. Okay, and all the local governments were under Wilhelm I as a result of all these changes. You'll see him referred to as both Wilhelm, Wilhelm, or William I. Okay, so southern German states didn't really want anything to do with the northern German states because they wanted to keep their independence. But they signed a military alliance with Prussia just in case there was any type of war with France. And they should have known better than to do that with Otto von Bismarck in charge, okay? Because Otto von Bismarck initiates a very strange misunderstanding between Prussia and France over one of Wilhelm's relatives that was trying to take the Spanish throne. So basically, he escalates the misunderstanding whenever they try and seek clarification, and pushes it to the point where they declare war in the Franco-Prussian War. So whenever Germany will invade France, they push right through French forces. French forces are all along the lines of France and Germany, but Germany instead will invade through Belgium, which it will do on two other occasions over the next 68 years, catching France by surprise 3 times. In this, Napoleon III was captured, which is going to end the French Empire. They're forced to give up Alsace-Lorraine, which is some lands in eastern France that will be given back after World War I. And also, France was required to pay 5 billion francs to Germany for this. As a final insult, but the culmination of everything that Wilhelm had been working for, they go to the Palace of Versailles, which was the French palace and seat of government, where he crowned himself where he was crowned the Kaiser or Emperor of Prussia. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, you see the word Kaiser. Kaiser is the German word for Caesar, which really was the term they used to refer to the Roman emperors. You'll also hear the word Tsar, which is used, and that's the Russian term for Caesar as well. And that had been gained whenever Ivan the Terrible went in and rescued Sophia, the last the last living heir of the Byzantine Empire as it was falling in 1453. She was rescued / kidnapped. She married Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Terrible, and at that point he took the title of Tsar or Caesar from that point forward. So that's how he legitimized himself. So we've discussed the creation of Italy. We've discussed the creation of Germany. Now let's look at Russia and its attempt at modernization. Now, compared to the rest of Europe, it was about 400 years behind the curve. Okay, and it lost the Crimean War, which also really hurt the prestige of the nation. Alexander II, who is in charge for about 25, 26 years, one of the first things he noticed was just how uneducated the peasants were. And you had a nation where they were unable to use modern weapons. And so he knew that if he was going to keep his empire or, move into a modern Europe, they had to do things to change that. So he's going to establish equality within Russia, abolish corporal and capital punishment, and he had local assemblies to be more responsive to the people called Zemstovs, and this would guide education, try and create famine relief, fix the roads in Russia, and get rid of serfdom. Now, the serfs would live. They basically had to work off their debt, and they would live in this village called a mir until they paid for the land that they received. But under Alexander II, for the first time in Russian history, peasants could basically marry whoever they wanted to. They could own property and they could sue. Before this, they were relegated to the manor that they were on, and any type of marriages were approved by the lord of the manor, and so this helps break down some of these walls and is done to try and improve the lives of the Russian people. Okay, now there's a group of Slavophiles who wanted to preserve Russian traditions. Okay, so there's always going to be some type of person that does not want to change the status quo because they're afraid of what it's going to mean for them. They saw Alexander II as a Westerner who wanted to modernize the nation. Okay, and a man by the name of Alexander Herzen wrote something called the Bell. Okay, the Bell was a book, and to kind of set the foundation for it, Alexander Herzen was expelled from Russia and was in exile. He was supposed to never come home, and his goal was the goal of a lot of Eastern Europeans, that if you used anarchy and if you started to use something called, or if you started to use assassinations, that those were valuable tools for creating change. And so this is a populist movement. Now, for those of you who learned about populist in U.S. history, this is a movement of the poor in America, and it kind of falls apart in the election of 1896 whenever a lot of their platforms accepted by the Democratic Party, and it starts a wave of 28 years of progressive reform to try and appease the poor farmers and the poor working class. But this populist movement in Russia is going to be a lot more violent. Okay, so one of these rebels is Vera Zasulich, and they shot and wounded one of the leaders of St. Petersburg. Someone else takes this, basically the reaction of the Russian government and the panic of the Russian government to inspire a group called the People's Will that will ultimately assassinate Alexander II. Okay, so Alexander III took over after his father was brutally murdered. through assassination. He decides that whenever he takes over, the first thing he needs to do is cough. And then after he's done coughing, he's going to go back to the old traditional ways, because he thinks if he does this, it'll make it less likely for him to be murdered like his father. So he expands the powers of the secret police. And even though Russians only made up 40% of the Russian population, he bans all non-Russian languages from school. Okay? And he wants to, along with his son, Nicholas II, and by the way, spoiler, he will also be violently assassinated. They're going to protect absolute power. By the way, things really work out bad for Nicholas II because he is brutally murdered along with his wife, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, which included Anastasia, if you've ever seen that cartoon. That's not really how that cartoon ends or begins. And their son, Alexei. So, a lot of murder, buried in unmarked graves, covered with acid, so their bodies were hard to identify. And they were actually just identified in the last 10 years. So, there were rumors that some of them had survived. You don't survive being shot and buried and covered in acid. That's just not a good way to go. Okay. Britain's Victorian age. Okay. Now, Britain had a queen by the name of Queen Victoria. She had like 14 children. And up until the last few years, she had the longest reign in English history. And during her reign, also middle class wages go up by about 25%. So, during World War I, just about every royal family in England was either one of her grandchildren or married to one of her nieces or nephews or someone in her family. If you know anything about European monarchies, they're all super inbred. If that's a superpower, that was the one that they had. So, the Reform Act of 1867, Tory leader Benjamin Disraeli, he doubled the number of voters that could vote in the general elections, and he also allowed some of the urban workers to vote as well. You still don't have universal male suffrage in England at that time. But the idea of the Reform Act was to allow more people to vote. Now, due to some things that were happening in the United States as well, with some of the corruption in elections, William Gladstone is going to open civil service jobs to exams instead of patronage. Now, the U.S. is going to do that with the Pendleton Act around the same time, but that's because of the assassination of one of the presidents. They also bring in the Australian ballot, which brings in secret ballot voting. And they also stopped the purchase of military commissions. Really, you didn't have to show any type of promise or understanding of military tactics to become a general. You just had to have someone in your family with enough money to buy the position for you. And then you could go in as incompetent as the most incompetent person on earth, but you got that position because your family bought it for you. And that stops under William Gladstone as well. And the Education Act of 1870 does something extremely controversial as well. And what it does is it opens up elementary schools for all kids. So the idea was not just to educate the wealthy, but educate all children. Which was very controversial at the time. Now, moving over to the United States, we're going to just mention what's going on there a little bit because it does affect some of the things that are happening in Europe. Okay, slavery was really controlled the economy, especially of the South. 93% of the cotton that was produced in the United States in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, and even into the early 1860s, 93% of the cotton was produced by 4 million slaves. Okay, in 1810, they produced about 178,000 bales of raw cotton. That was worth about 10 million. But by 1860, they were producing about 4.5 million bales of cotton. and making about $249 million off of that. So it was basically the entire foundation of the southern economy. You still had some people growing sugar cane, you still had some people growing tobacco, very little industrialization, some ranching going on in Texas and some of the western territories, but the South was mainly a set of cotton plantations. Seeing some of the reform movements going on in Europe, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed slavery to be decided on popular sovereignty, and this is going to be something that will create the Democratic Party under Abraham Lincoln and split the Democratic Party. Ultimately, Lincoln would win the election of 1860 because his main opponent, the Democrats, had split their votes between the North and the South, and that gave him just enough to take the presidency. And this fear of this Republican who was anti-slavery thought that he was going to go immediately against, immediately fight for the emancipation of all the slaves. The truth was Lincoln wanted to contain slavery and let it die out over time, and didn't want to have to divide the United States or go to war to end it. This would change whenever 7 states seceded before he took office, and he had to go to war to try and preserve the Union. And within 2 years of the start of the war, he had started to end slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation, and eventually with the 13th Amendment that banned slavery. The Civil War itself, 620,000 men would die from either battle or disease. Much like European wars, though, 2 out of every 3 people that died in the Civil War died from disease. The Emancipation Proclamation is something that Lincoln's given credit for as creating change, but in reality all it did was free slaves in territories that the United States didn't control. In reality, the people that actually freed the slaves were the slaves themselves in the majority of situations, as the emancipating armies were going through. The 13th Amendment, which was passed at the end of January of 1865, just 3 months before he was assassinated, would legally end slavery before the war was ended. This modern war, this industrialized war of the Civil War, really becomes a model for how World War I is going to use trenches, wide scale, and basically the way that they would rush the other side to try and break the gridlock. And the big difference between using this in the Civil War and using this in World War I was the advent of the machine gun, which made most of the efforts in trench warfare obsolete almost immediately. Basically, the belief was that if you were brave enough, you could take the other trenches. The truth was, a lot of people were still using guns that you had to load each shot one at a time, and someone who was well trained could do it in about 30 seconds. So if you're about 300 yards away and you break into a run and they fire and you get up and you start running immediately, you're going to get over to the other side in somewhere between 45 seconds and about 1 minute and 15 seconds for the average soldiers. So as they're rushing forward, you have the other side that is loading. Now you have loaded weapons as you're running, and once you see the other side has reloaded, then you will stand up and fire, and then you'll continue to go, but you got your bayonet on the end of the gun. And the thought was, if you were brave enough, you could survive rushing the other side. Now with the machine gun, it fired out a bullet it fired out about 5 bullets every 2 seconds. And at the rate of fire that they had from that, it didn't take really any skill or accuracy to mow down any approaching group. Sherman also started a policy of Sherman was one of the generals under Grant, who was under Lincoln at the end of the war, And he started this new policy of total war where it wasn't just against the armies but against the civilian population. They burned everything of value from Atlanta all the way over to the Atlantic. And ultimately the Civil War would end in a united nation, but a lot of those fractures would continue even after the war was over. Now let's talk about the Great War of Independence for Canada. So this really happens in 1867. Now, the British had controlled Canada since the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War in Europe. So they controlled it from 1763 into the 1860s. The upper region of Canada and Ontario was all English speaking, and Quebec is really more of a French Canadian area. So in the 1850s, Quebec is going to rebel and demand a separate nation. They wanted all men to be able to vote. They wanted freedom of the press. But whenever they stopped the rebellion, Parliament decided it was going to separate Canada from them so they could let the Canadians kind of deal with their own situation and problems. Britain's going to really, everything that Britain does, Canada's going to support. Every time they go to war, they'll send troops. And in all honesty, whenever they see the Queen of England today, they see that as their queen, as they did Queen Victoria back during that time. So it has its own constitution and parliament, but there's not a lot of difference between the way the Canadians run their government and the way that Britain does. We've made it to the end of yet another day. I hope everyone's doing well. Please don't cocaine, don't AIDS, and don't COVID. Don't spread COVID. If you see someone and they have like a bucket of COVID, tell them to, dispose of that safely. And anyway, everyone have a great day, and I will see you soon.